In the October midterm budget, Minister Tito Mboweni hinted to the possibility of raising taxes. However, at that time, the conversation around funding of vaccines had not featured. Two economists say, given the improved revenue collections, the funding of the vaccines will not be too heavy on the fiscus.
The total government revenues are about 150 billion ahead of the expectation, ahead of the forecast that was provided in the MTPPS, which is a bit of positive news, with November and December numbers alone being higher than the two prior years, which had no COVID impact, which shows the remarkable recovery in number one, the economy, as well as revenue collection. So now that alone could be enough to fund the vaccine and the cost of the vaccine. Which on its own, in isolation, is not that onerous on the fiscus, but importantly, it does add to a growing list of demands.
The vaccines will probably, in a worst case scenario, cost South Africa 10 or 20 billion rand, and in a broader scope of things, that is really not a huge amount of money. And in fact, recently, tax revenue has been doing a little bit better than expected. However, the reality also is that the fiscal accounts in South Africa is in very, very deep trouble. To pay an additional 10 or 20 billion rands certainly going to make a difference, but hardly. The real big issues that we need to do is to cut back on other kinds of state spending.
Treasury has in recent days hinted that it may need to raise taxes in order to fund the vaccines. Mkhwanazi says government may rethink this option.
The risk of a material tax increases has been diminished, and we believe that debt to GDP trajectory would be slightly better than what was presented in the MTPPS, and that is positive. But other options that are available to Treasury would include, reprioritizing spending. That would include, delaying some programs that are now deemed less urgent in the context of the pandemic, or some projects may not even be necessary in the context of the post-COVID or post-pandemic world. But another option would also be to tap into those facilities the IMF has designed to help poorer countries to deal with the impacts of the pandemic.
Ruud says the funding of vaccine is government's least of worries, but it is the overall spending needs that need to be reconsidered.
More importantly, and much more importantly, is what can be done to reduce the state's overall spending on things like, for example, the wage bill and state-owned enterprises and the like, because we are probably very close to a so-called fiscal debt trap in which we find ourselves today.
Executive Chief Economist at Alexander Forbes says any vaccine cost concerns should never override human lives.
What we need to do is to find the funding to actually procure the vaccine at all costs. Even if it means we close some of the things that can be delayed in the current spending, let's do so. Even if it means we go and borrow from the market at roughly 9% to 10% bond yields, if you take the 10-year bond yield, let's do so. Even if it means we are going to go to the IMF and borrow 20 billion rand in order to fund the vaccine, let's do so. The cost of not funding the vaccine far outweighs the cost of human lives.
Diabosito, SABC News, Johannesburg.